Hi, everyone. I want to welcome you back. Thanks for coming back after lunch for our second panel. I noticed that they didn't serve champagne at the lunch. That's probably good because you're going to want to be on your toes for this part. My name is Connor Cunningham, and I'm a second-year RICA, a master's student here with a focus on the Black Sea, specifically Moldova, Romania, and Ukraine, and also focus on Russian disinformation. I remember interviewing for the RICA program for Moldova in mid-February 2022 and thinking most importantly about the appalling consequences of a potential Russian invasion for the Ukrainian people, but also, to a lesser degree, how this would redefine the field of Russian and Eurasian studies forever.
And my name is Olga Kion. I'm also a second-year RICA student, and my research and coursework focuses on the question of memory politics and historical memory in the Russia-Ukraine relationship, so specifically focused on the context of identity formation. And with this, my thesis focuses on the removal of Lenin statues in Ukraine since 2014, also known as the Lenin Napad, and the role it has played in defining Ukrainian national identity. And I've been lucky to take classes here with incredible professors, and even luckier to have an incredibly tight, close group of friends here.
Our job and our honor here today is to introduce the second panel. What has the war taught us about Russia? This panel brings together scholars and thinkers from very different disciplines to reflect on what we know now that we didn't know before 2014. My thesis advisor, Timothy J. Colton, will get us started with some reflections from Russian politics. Professor Colton is the Morris and Anna Feldberg Professor of Government and Russian Studies at Harvard University, as well as chair of the Harvard Academy for International and Area Studies. He served an 18-year sentence as a faculty director of the Davis Center and has taught and advised many of the people in this room. He is the author of a number of books, including A Definitive History of Moscow, Yeltsin, A Life, and the 2017 book, Everyone Loses, The Ukraine Crisis and the Ruinous Contest for Post-Soviet Eurasia, which he co-authored with Samuel Sharp. Professor Colton is currently doing research on several topics, including the domestic Russian component of the war with Ukraine, and links among regionalism, the great powers, and the multipolar world.
Our second panelist will explore what we've learned about the Russian economy. Alexandra Prokopenko has been a researcher at Zeus in Berlin since May 2023. She's also a non-resident scholar at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. Alexandra is an expert on Russian economic and monetary policy and the decision-making processes of the Kremlin. From 2017 to 2022, Prokopenko worked as an advisor at the Central Bank of Russia and the Higher School of Economics in Moscow. Before that, she was a journalist for 9 years, working as a reporter at the TASS news agency and then at Vedomosti. In 2018, she completed a master's in sociology at the University of Manchester and the Moscow School of Social and Economic Sciences, aka Shaninka.
Our third panelist will help us to understand what the war tells us about Russian and Soviet history. Terry Martin is the George F. Baker Professor of Russian Studies at Harvard. An expert on Soviet nationalities policy, he is the author of The Affirmative Action Empire, Nations and Nationalism in the USSR, from 1923 to 1939, and co-editor with Ronald Suney of A State of Nations, Empire and Nation-Making in the Age of Lenin and Stalin. Professor Martin has also written on religion, political and administrative history, Soviet neo-traditionalism, and the political police, as well as the Nazi-Soviet comparison. He is working on a book on the politics and sociology of state information gathering in the USSR from the revolution through the death of Stalin.
And we will round off our disciplinary tour with Michael Kunichika, Professor of Russian and Film and Media Studies at Amherst College. Since 2018, he has also served as the director of the Amherst College Center for Russian Culture. While a senior fellow at the Davis Center in 2013 and 2014, Professor Kunichika worked on his book, Our Native Antiquity, Archaeology and Aesthetics in the Culture of Russian Modernism. He is currently completing a monograph on Specters of Empire, Race and Revolution in Early Soviet Cinema, a project also supported by the Davis Center, and has embarked on a new project, Archaeology in the Twilight of Utopia, Late Socialism and the Rediscovery of the Archaic. And with that, Alexandra, over to you.
Thank you. Thank you, Connor and Olga. Thank you to our distinguished panelists. We're going to get started right away and turn over the floor to Tim, who's going to tell us a little bit about what the war has told us about Russia that we didn't know before.
About Russian politics.
Russian politics.
It was actually a 20-year sentence, but I got 2 years off for good behavior. Okay, so I thought about this and given it some thought, I mean, at a more general level, what kind of conversation we could have on this topic 20 months into a major historical experience like this. I mean, the way it's set up, it kind of, the language implies, probably unintentionally, that things are a little simpler than I think they really are. So the war itself, after all, is not a voice or an actor. It's an experience with a lot of different things going on, many of them very tragic. But at our end, so that's there's no single voice there. But at our end, I think a big question is really how similar are the ears and brains that absorb the lesson, whatever it is that the war is teaching us. And so, if you think of it in really simplistic terms, there's one voice and one receptor, and then there's an experience. Well, there's a treatment, experimental treatment, and at time n, things are the way that the receptor understands them to be, and then at time n plus 1, something may or may not have changed, and you do a comparison of one to the other, and you understand the effects of the treatment. But in this case, I mean, did we ever really agree, those of us in the field, exactly what things were like at time n? I teach Russian politics. I'm teaching a lecture course this semester, as well as a seminar in which Russia features. And, what I often emphasize is actually different points of view and debates, as opposed to a single, received truth. And so, to the extent that that makes sense, then you would expect the war to be teaching or conveying in some fashion not one lesson, but maybe multiple lessons, which may be simply diverse points of view or diverse different takes, let's say, but they might also reflect, rival points of view, where not a single one dominates the scene. So I know this is a bit abstract way to start, but it might be fun to think about this over the next hour. So I wrote a book a few years ago called Russia, What Everyone Needs to Know. It's in an Oxford University Press series of very slender books on a topic like a country or a phenomenon, a historical event. And I'm trying to rewrite it now, but it's revised it because it's terribly out of date, but it's proving to be quite a challenge because it's hard to know. We're chasing a moving target. And so not so long ago, in revising the introduction, I wrote down 3 maxims that I think are helpful in thinking about Russia, and not just about Russian politics. So here they are, 1, 2, 3. Number 1, don't think that you know it all. So be modest and humble. This might apply to almost any subject matter, but somehow Russia seems to evoke this sort of feeling. Secondly, don't be surprised to be surprised. I'm not the first person who said this about Russia, of course. Expect the unexpected. And thirdly, don't be afraid to update your priors once you've been surprised. So in thinking about Russian politics now more concretely, I have only a few minutes. What is new? Is anything surprising? So I'll leave the history to Terry Martin, something that's come up now repeatedly in conversations, and Terry and I had one of these not long ago. Does it turn out that the collapse of the USSR was a longer and more difficult agony than we realized when it got started? So to the extent that this war is a continuation of the events of 1985 to 1991, should we somehow reconsider the collapse and its attendant phenomena? So I won't express an opinion on this, but I'm sure this is something that Professor Martin will want to take up. There are a number of people in this course, in this class, this room, what am I saying, who are taking...
There is
It's non-credit, don't worry. There are some students here who are taking a class that I teach with a colleague, and we had a guest the other day, Maxime Boyko. I don't know how many people here know him, who is an economist who works here at Harvard, teaches some things in the economics department. He's a former high official. He was a vice premier for a while under Yeltsin, made a lot of money in business, did very well for himself, but left Russia in 2014 and built a new life here. But I still get him to come and talk with my students every now and then, and it's always worth doing. And he this was, I think, on Thursday, got stumped on the question of why this war erupted in the first place. And he was trying to fit it into his vision of Putin and how Putin does business. And his conclusion, and he discussed it with the students for almost an hour, as I recall. He wanted to hear what they had to say. But he said, his conclusion was, and I think there's a lot to this, that the initiation of the war is actually quite out of character with the way Putin normally operates. So that, in the quarter century that he's been there, he's typically been a rational actor. It seems that in terms of relating means to ends, finding means that are proportionate to the task or challenge at hand, not at all impulsive. In fact, he tends to procrastinate. He'll delay things year after year when he knows that they're going to be costly to him politically, and generally quite risk averse. Wouldn't you agree? But what he did last February was accepted a massive risk, and he should have known better, of course, just how serious the risk was. He was ill-informed about how things were going to go. But even if they'd gone well, invading a neighboring country of 15 million people when this hasn't been done in Europe since 1939 was quite the undertaking. So in a sense, it seemed out of character. We're interested in events that have followed the full-scale invasion. And Maxime's position was, and let's see if somebody wants to challenge this, that actually, once that had been done and the initial gambit failed miserably to deliver on objectives, Putin kind of reverted to his normal self and actually became, in a sense, the more rational, proportional, risk-averse national leader that he's been more or less all along. So I haven't had a lot of time to think this over. 48 hours is not long enough, perhaps, and I haven't seen this backed up in scholarship, but it is an interesting thought, in which case the initiation of the war is certainly a shock, and so to the extent that when you study Russian politics or Russian life, don't be surprised to be surprised. So there's the big surprise, that a highly risky undertaking was taken by a risk-averse president who then seemed to some extent to revert to form. So does that mean there have been no surprises or shocks in addition to the invasion itself? No, I wouldn't say that. Certainly there are some things that have happened that seem, maybe you don't want to call them a surprise, but there's certainly innovations or there are changes in the status quo. We haven't had a lot of time to weigh how significant they are or to see how they play out, but I have a very short checklist here. One of them, I think, would be the pretty sharp, direct turn towards isolationism on various fronts, withdrawal from multilateral organizations, severance of connections to the extent possible with Europe, Russia, which joined the Council of Europe, not the EU, of course, but the Council of Europe, and undertook all of the obligations that it entailed. Under Yeltsin, I think in 1995, officially withdrew from the Council of Europe last March on the eve of being kicked out, actually. So it was just a question of who was going to pull the trigger more quickly. But and this meant that Russia no longer recognized the authority of the European Court on Human Rights, which is, I think, a very big, at least symbolic, and not merely symbolic step. But it is also withdrawn from all kinds of other organizations and undertakings, arms control treaties, multilateral organizations of various kinds, as I have mentioned. It's withdrawn from the World Tourism Organization. For some reason, it's without explanation. And this has been, I think, paired with greater and greater emphasis on cultural closure, not complete closure, but building walls of a sort. So the super patriotism now being built into the school curriculum considerably more than before. The interesting turn as well towards civilizational thinking. Now, this has been around for a while. Putin has used the word on and off for about 7 or 8 years, but all of a sudden, it's being placed in doctrinal statements in a very, direct way. So, as of March of last year, this year, 2023, the Foreign Ministry's official doctrinal statement of purpose, what is Russia about in international affairs, now has a number which pays homage to the fact that Russia is not a normal state, it is a civilizational state. This is something quite unprecedented, and it may just be bullshit, of course, but we'll see. But I don't think they take it lightly, and I think there's a lot of politics and ideology behind this, and we'll see how it plays out. So that, I think, is already different. The theme of the diaspora has already come up. So Russia now has a partly politicized diaspora in numbers for the first time since the 1920s, I suppose. I guess I'm not a historian. I don't have the confidence to judge exactly, but I guess my impression would be contrary to what Serhiy Plokhý says, that I don't think that really the fate of the country ever was really determined by Russians living abroad or is likely to be in future. But nonetheless, the fact
Guriev said that.
Sorry?
Not Plokhý, Guriev said that.
I'm sorry. No, Serhiy agreed, actually.
Mike said on the panel.
They both
okay.
yeah. So I'm not sure it's as important as it might seem, but it's not trivial, and it's, you know, I think it's something to watch, and it should be part of our enterprise to understand what's going on. It's also paired. I mean, one of the reasons, at least one of the enabling reasons that brought this into being was that the border is open. And that also is kind of surprising and a little bit out of character with Putin's sort of managerial approach and control-oriented approach. You would have thought he would have had the border closed for exit purposes at least, but that hasn't happened yet. And that's probably having to do with his managerial, again, rational calculations of the political risks and costs involved in offending the population by closing the border. Then there's Prigozhin, right, and the mercenaries and all of that. We're all familiar with the raw facts, but we don't really yet know, you know, what to take away from this bizarre episode. It's certainly an innovation in Russian politics. Maybe it's just a flash in the pan at, you know, that those who rule learned from their mistakes and giving an individual like Prigozhin too much scope to act. But in any case, it obviously bears watching, and is potentially, there are certainly Russians who think it's very significant. We also know that it's not just a matter of Wagner. There are other groups out there, so mostly small, but many Russian state agencies and firms have actually been instructed to create small militias of their own, particularly in the border zone. So that's, you know, a kind of outsourcing of state capacity, which is also quite surprising. As for the fear factor, which Sergei Guriev brought up this morning, I don't believe myself there was a toggle switch that was just triggered in February, and all of a sudden Russia went from being a spin dictatorship to a fear dictatorship. I find that quite implausible. I think that, yes, for sure, the fear has become a more significant factor. I readily grant that point. But, you know, I think this has been building for a long time, and that most of the instruments that were deployed were pretty familiar. They'd been around for quite a while in almost every case. So control over assembly, for example, they increased the penalties. Likewise, with a lot of other practices that had been or policies that have been introduced as early as 2010 or 2012. For example, the foreign agent law has been around since 2012. They have stiffened it repeatedly, and they ratcheted it up another degree. So to me, this is fear being introduced somewhat gradually, and without in any way crowding out spin. I don't see that at all. It seems to me the spin is as strong as it ever was. And they spin, but everybody spins. So it's not just the regime spinning. There are a lot of other spinners out there, and there are probably more of them than there were before, because the government's being criticized on several flanks, right, by the more centrist and liberal portion of the population, but also by a hard right, which thinks it's not doing enough to win the war. And finally, just in 1 minute, other marks of continuity, I think there are quite a few of them, actually. So in certain ways, and I've spoken with a lot of Russians about this, the ones that I'm lucky enough to see here, my somewhat depleted Zoom contacts with Moscow, you know, that in certain ways, I think the institutional performance is reminiscent of some episodes, at least in the Russian past. So you start with a mistake, and then, you know, some heads roll, not so many in this case. You regroup and you dig in your heels and try and persist. And that's sort of how the war, I think, has been fought. They screwed it up royally in the first phase, took it on the chin, and then started to dig in their heels and demonstrate persistence. And I think that applies to the whole system, or many parts, I should say, many parts of the system, maybe not to its entirety. And it's kind of surprised a lot of people. I can't say that it surprised me or not. It's just I duly noted. It's very interesting, and maybe it shouldn't be that surprising. Maybe it's not surprising here that we're not being surprised by persistence of institutions. And finally, at the mass level, we have a bunch of survey data available, and it's been drawn on in previous talks this morning, and it's more or less reliable. Of course, one has to discount maybe certain pieces of this, but it does show that after a lot of murkiness in 2022, that it didn't take that long, in fact, for public opinion to swing. It's not only a matter of how the war is being fought, so that the majority of Russians accept that whether they thought it should have been launched or not, and probably a fifth or more of Russians think it was a mistake, that Russia can't afford to lose it. And what has gone along with this is increasing confidence being reported by credible, independent, non-state polling agencies in Russian institutions. Actually, what's kind of amazing is that it's across the board. Confidence in the president has gone up. He now is higher than the army, whereas before the invasion, the army was higher. But the president, army, security services at the top. But right through the whole list of 15 or 18, whatever it is, institutions, confidence in charities has gone up. Confidence in small and medium enterprise has gone up. Confidence in regional governors has gone up. In some cases, confidence in the Duma has gone up, for God's sake, to more than 40%. So I realize I've given you a little bit of a jumble. It's not clear what to make of this, and we shouldn't flagellate ourselves. We're not even through the second year of the war. But clearly it's a big event, and it could be that the long-term consequences are going to be very, very significant. But we're not in a position do much more than speculate about this and do our job, which is to track things and analyze them with a cool head.
Thank you, Tim. So, Alexandra, let me turn it over to you. I think what we've seen in terms of the macroeconomic reaction to the war has actually been quite different from the political reaction and certainly the military approach. But please, bring us up to date.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for having me here and happy anniversary. It's quite complicated, very not easy to speak on economics after a great presentation of Sergei Guriev, but I will try. I'll try to be brief and precise. So I will bring you here 3 points. The first one is that, as we see now, Putin has no limits in terms of casualties, neither human nor financial, on his path of the goal, whatever this goal can be. We don't know what his goal actually. So the war became existential not only for the sons of political regime of Vladimir Putin, but also for the economy. And considering this year and next year budget of 2024, the government's priorities are financing the war in Ukraine, spending money on security services, integrating occupied territories into Russia, and social handouts. For the first time in modern Russian history, has been allocated more than $145 billion of expenditures into military and security service, compared to only 100 onto social spending and national economy combined. I mean, it's massive. And what I witness now from my macro perspective is the structural shift from the civil part of the economy to the military one. And if we simply divide the economy on 2 major parts, probably equal before the war, well, partly equal. The civil was bigger, so the civil sector and the military industry one. Now the military industry sector distributes more than, I think, 1/3 of the aggregated demand of the economy. And speaking about military industry sector, I mean not only military industry complex itself, which produce armory and weapons, but also industries serving the front line, like clothing industry, food suppliers, pharmaceuticals, logistics. Here we also need to and also putting into military industry military industry sector, the widening military industry sector, those who receive payments from the government. I mean, military people, personnel, their families, receivers of social payments, different kind of social payments, receivers of payments for those who were wounded or who were dead. This creates a huge pressure on the demand, on the consumer side demand, on the side of consumer demand. And the key question here to me is Russian economy militarized enough to collapse when this demand would be eliminated when the war ends, come to its end, or come to from its hot side to the cold one. Of course, we can say that fulfilling stockpiles and working on warehouses can soften the shock, but it would still be the structural shock for the economy, and it would be the fifth structural shock for Russian economy during the last 15 years, which from the perspective of economic theory tells us that Russian economy was under constant pressure during the last 15 years. So Kremlin is going to pay for these extremely high expenditures from oil and gas revenues, thanks to buyers from China and India, basically. And the government put in budget the average price of $85 per barrel, and the exchange rate to be 90.1 ruble per dollar. And this combination actually means inflation. But yet, it's not a problem of today, which brings me to my second point. Putin easily sacrificed tomorrow well-being of his people and his country for the sake of today. The recent example is recently imposed capital controls, which we all know central bank and the reasonable part of the government were strictly opposed, but imposing these cap controls indicates the growing pressure on financial leadership from the government of upcoming elections, which basically means that the government easily needs to have a very easy tool to quickly calibrate the exchange rate, which now is the function of state expenditures and capital outflow. So it means that non-monetary. The risks are on non-monetary side, and the central bank, which was actually responsible for this, is an obstacle for the government. And recent decision of the central bank to raise the key rate and do the step of 2 percentage point, it's quite high, and I consider this more as a fight for its independence rather than something related to inflation and monetary and price stability. Along with the recent imposition of capital controls, also were imposed tariffs on non-oil exporters. And these decisions were never discussed widely with the market as this was done previously, which also brings me to the point that Russia is moving away from a market-based system, and market-based economy was one of the key factors of resilience of Russian economy during 2022. So it's market-based capitalism is abandoned for the sake of mobilized wartime economy. And here I'm still trying to figure out, is Russian economy militarized enough? So mandatory sale of foreign currency earnings, as we all know, provoke devaluation sentiment, and as a consequence fuels inflationary expectations, and it brings also mistrust to ruble and to Russian financial system, and it undermines the macro stability, which was the point Putin bragged before, but it was sacrificed to the sake of coming up elections and for the comfort background Putin wants to have when he will announce that he will run on March 2024, and basically win. So my third point here also relates to the decision-making process, because Putin it seems obvious that Putin seriously believes that much of the collapse of the great, from his perspective, empires, Russian and USSR, was due to poor financial management. That's why he is. That's why he's so supportive to current financial management, and that's a paradox that we can witness the independence independent central bank under Putin's dictatorship. Well, basically, this independence was also one of the reasons why Russian economy was so resilient in 2022. But usually, economic success comes with the vertigo, and from my perspective, the mobilization of 2022 was largely driven by the economic success of the spring. So if Russian economy performed badly after all sanctions were imposed, I think that Putin will think twice or even 3 times before he will announce mobilization, which brings the system of management in Russia to almost its dysfunctional state. But as we remember, the mobilization was ended. Well, it was never ended legally, but it was ended vocally because the system couldn't bear the burden which mobilization brought there. So this year, suboptimal decisions, this year I mean 2022 and both 2023, effectively undoing institutions such as budget rule, fiscal stability, and predictable tax system. Because new tariffs and taxes imposed like this, we cannot speak about predictable tax conditions anymore. And I see here that, pure economic success, because in terms of figures, Russian economy, performs relatively better than much of advanced economies. And upcoming elections opens the room for further bad decisions, which can bring the situation. Well, it is a bad hope, but it's the only hope I have. I'm more pessimistic than Sergei Guriev here. So the situation looks stable and solid in terms of figures, as I said, but more or less, I witness how Putin trying to solve the impossible trinity. So from one point, somehow maintain economic stability, also maintain the appearance of reciprocal contract with the people, so-called business as usual, and to finance the war. How long it can last, I don't know. We'll see soon, I think. I will stop here. Thank you.
Terry, history.
History it is. I'm in a difficult situation compared to the others because, in principle, while the war can influence politics, economics, and culture, I think the second law of thermodynamics prevents it from influencing the past. But it obviously influences what historians think about and what issues are salient to us. And like my colleague Serhii Plokhy, it brings up for me the question of Russian national identity in both the long term and in the last 30 years. And I prefer to think about Russian national identity rather than Russian imperialism, which is all the rage right now, because there's a certain risk of tautology in the current focus on Russian imperialism. That is that because the war is imperialist, one trolls Russian history for instances of imperialism and then uses those to argue why Russia is behaving imperialistically. And I worry that is going to end up doing more violation to Russian history than use. With respect to Russian nationality, there are questions of the boundaries of the Russian nation and questions about the contemporary kind of content or style of Russian nationalist discourse. So Serhii addressed the boundaries issues. I'll just briefly summarize what I was going to say about that, which is that I think that Russia is in an unusual situation right now in having, maybe 4 viable boundaries of Russianness. There's, the ethnic Russians, a passport sort of identity in the Soviet sense of Russianness. There is the Ruski in that sense. There's the Rossiyski sense, the sense of now citizen of the Russian Federation, but historically subject of the Russian Empire. And there was always a conflict between those two identities, because the core of the Russian Empire and its periphery was less clear, obviously, than in an overseas empire. And then because Soviet essentially took over the role of Rossiyski to some degree in the period from 1917 to 1991. And that still has an effective component, and Russians identified more with the Soviet Union as a whole than other people. That is also out there. And then there's the big Russian, or the triune Russian nation that Sergei talked about Russianness, and that Putin revived in 2021, that is of Russianness is embracing the Russians, Belarusians, and Ukrainians. So there's kind of four dialects of Russian nationhood or nationalism, and you can sometimes see Putin or other Russian propagandalists kind of toggling between these. And I think that helps to explain some of the incoherence of Russian patriotic discourse over the last decades, not just during the war. On the triune Russian nation, or big Russian nation, I would just add to what Sergei says is that this now appears as an imperial project, but of course also could be considered to be a nation-building project. And if you look to and this is again why I worry about projecting these things back in time, because if you look to the 19th century, the German and Italian projects of unification are viewed now as nation-building projects, but at the time there were plenty of Bavarians and plenty of Sicilians who viewed them as imperial projects. And in the 19th century, it was an open question whether the big Russian nation project would be viewed by Ukrainian speakers as an imperial or a nation-building project, just as it's a question today in Belarus. And it was a question in the Donbass in 2014. It's the reception of the project that decides whether it's imperial or nation building. And there I'm very much in agreement with Sergei that 2014 and especially 2022 has been decisive in making the imperial reception hegemonic in Ukraine. The second question is the content or style of Russian nationalism today. And here I have in mind the kind of resentful, self-pitying, xenophobic, sort of Russophobia obsessed, they all hate us, inflection of a lot of Russian nationalism. And it strikes me that that is as important or more important than the boundary issue as a kind of emotional impetus for aggression and for euphoria, let's say, of the cream nosh type of phenomenon that we got in 2014. So here I'll go back to Tim's question about 1991 and forward, just as Sergei did. So for 2 decades, I've taught a course on the end of communism in Eastern Europe and Russia. And for a decade before 2014, I would always give a lecture trying to explain why you didn't have a Serbian post-Yugoslav style conflict in the Soviet Union, because it seemed that the parallels were very close, and this is what Ned Keenan had in mind too. That in both cases you had a beach diaspora or perception of a beach diaspora abroad, and in both cases you had an ideology amongst some Serbs and some Russians of a sense that that the majority nationalities' national interests were scapegoated at the expense of the minority nationalities. And Putin, of course, also in 2021 and in 2022 echoed that position. In Serbia, this became politically empowered and led to the war there. And if we remember back to 1991, I don't know what your memories of it are, Tim, but now we're told that everybody was euphoric about the end of history. But I remember all of the concern about Weimar Russia. and an enormous, concern. And in Russia, that ideology was there. You can read Prokhanov and Din and Zavtra that was being published at the time, or listen to Zyuganov. And it was there in the Samizdat of the 1970s, Shaferovich, and even in the published work of the village prose writers. But it was marginalized in the 1990s. And you can give lots of reasons. You can say that the Serbians had a anti-colonial nationalism from being part of the Ottoman Empire, and that was their myth, which Russians didn't have, or that Serbians faced a greater security dilemma than the Russians because the Russians could protect their beach diaspora, having greater power. In any case, it just didn't happen, and we sort of forgot about it. And Steve Kotkin wrote a book called Armageddon Averted until 2014, when I had to shift my lecture to try to explain Armageddon Postponed. Well, why this delay? In particular, why a delay after, a decade of the highest growth in Russian history that you would have thought ought to have calmed resentment and not seen it grow? I'm raising that question, not answering it here. You have the typical sort of foreign policy Putin-centered, argument that it's NATO expansion and Kosovo and Iraq wars and the interpretation of the color revolutions. And perhaps that's adequate. It certainly is key for Putin. But it doesn't seem to get at the emotion behind that form of nationalism. And it certainly seems to me that Russia was somewhat distinct, maybe amongst elites, maybe not wholly, but in the kind of sense that the economic and social collapse of the 1990s, it happened everywhere, and that was worse in Ukraine than in Russia, was understood as a kind of national humiliation, which was analyzed by Sergei Ushakin in his book, The Patriotism of Despair, that seemed to sort of produce this kind of ideology and latent ressentiment that Putin, who was a skeptic of this type of actual thinking in his early time period, later seems to have drawn upon. And unlike the big Russian nation, which Sergei postulated that the war might lead Russians to reject, it's not so clear that war will mitigate against this characteristic. Thanks.
Okay. Thanks, Terry. That is a good segue to Michael's unenviable task.
Yes, you can
of covering what the war has taught us or shown us about Russian culture and literature.
Okay.
Good luck.
Thank you. I'm extremely honored to be here, not at all nervous. But it has been extremely interesting to listen as a literary scholar to the various accounts, because all of these different accounts about history, the different metaphors and discourses have been at play, are things that we have been analyzing and seeing really at work within the astonishing place in which culture has served as a front of the war. And so my remarks are really about the variety of responses that we're going to see there. I will show a slide about Pushkin being dethroned. And one of those things is really, likewise, across all of the fields, we've seen sort of urgent, agonized, fitful, conflicted responses really to the question about what is to be done with Russian culture. And it has been a sort of remarkable period in which you also see, just in the previous panel, which is extraordinary for really also in a way that you never want to see Russian writers named in this particular way, but Solzhenitsyn, Pushkin, Dostoevsky really coming to the fore as ideologues of and preparing the groundwork for Russian imperialism. I think most of us have been sort of found remarkable the scale of the different sort of theaters in which this front has been playing out. So anything from the New Yorker to the Times Literary Supplement to the boardrooms of the Metropolitan Opera to festivals, classes, and conferences. Even the European Parliament held a session entitled Pushing Pushkin, the Imperialism and Decolonization of Russian Culture. And so it's operating on so many levels that I thought what I would try to do is give just a kind of 3 glimpses into the different ways in which I think we are seeing this question around culture play out and the ways in which they are prompting critical reassessments of past pedagogy and a kind of renewed programmatic focus on the way those practices may have unwittingly reproduced various structures of culture power. So the first example is an exhibition, Modernism in Ukraine, which opened in December 1922 at the Thyssen in Madrid. It was entitled In the Eye of the Storm, Modernism in Ukraine, 1900 to 1930, which was a remarkable undertaking. Those of you who followed it, followed the fact that they brought quite a bit of paintings out of Kyiv in the middle of the night, in convoy, at the risk of bombing. It displays some extraordinary figures, everyone from Alexandra Exter, Alexander Bokhamazov, Vasil Yermilov. And one of the things that was really quite crucial is already evidenced in the title, which was that it wasn't Ukrainian modernism, it was modernism in Ukraine, which really emphasized the idea in which Ukraine itself participated in a broad variety of networks. It enabled a kind of very savvy, I think, navigation of the idea of the fact that there are artists who are being asserted as ethnically Ukrainian, and then there are artists who really undertook their critical practices or work within Ukraine itself. So this is why the show could have, on the one hand, Alexandra Exter, but on the other, Elisitsky, who was there as part of the Kulturliga. What was interesting also about the show was this idea of the one image of the Soviet Union that you get as a kind of the Soviet Union that repressed Ukrainian culture. And one of the prevailing narratives of the show really was the destruction of these various sorts of modernist impulses. So there was a kind of twin destruction, both of modernism really and Ukraine. But what was interesting for me is that, so the Thyssen sits at one corner of the so-called Golden Triangle. And I was thinking about this from the previous panel, which I thought made some extraordinary comments really about the question of, well, which imperialism are we talking about and which historical imperialism are we thinking about? So you could take a tour that day, let's say, along the Golden Triangle. If you wanted a break from history, you could go to the Prado, only to remember the founding of the Prado by Charles III. But then you could also go to the Reina Sofia. And one of the things that's important about the Reina Sofia is that it's where you have the Guernica right on this main floor. Guernica, to recall, commemorates the Luftwaffe's aerial bombardment of the city in 1937. And it has become obviously the quintessential, let's say, image of aerial bombardment and the destruction of civilian populations. What's interesting about the room is the preceding rooms, and here I was thinking about Fiona Hill's comments. One thing that's really striking is that to give historical setting to this is that it also focuses on the pavilion that it was displayed in 1937, which is famous for the great confrontation of Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union on the Trocadero. And so one of the things that you will also see at this exhibition is quite a few posters in celebration of the Soviet Union, given its role as leading really sort of anti-fascism. And so what was really singular about this show and this particular moment are all of the kinds of histories that are being narrated, erased, reinscribed, that we are sort of dealing with at this particular moment as we think broadly about what to do with Russian culture. So one of the ways, just to pick up on some of Terry's points, one of the ways that we're seeing this kind of the use of history being played out is obviously the re-ascription of historical identity to various artists. So the Met, for example, reclassified Quinji, Ayvazovsky, and Ilya Repin now as Ukrainian. And I just want to indicate one of the challenges that this poses and one of the ongoing sort of debates that we're having, and particularly in the history of art, is one of the figures who was displayed sort of prominently at the Thyssen show was Sofia Delaunay-Turk. And what you can see in one of the classic ways in which you identify her culture in the catalogs of museums is French, born in Ukraine, Russian Empire. And so it enacts in every way the various predicaments that we are having as we try to sort through who is an artist, what is ethnic identity, so on and so forth. And those are the things that are profoundly animating, I think, what's happening in culture or Russian literary studies or Slavic studies generally. So I want to turn, the other major front, of course, that we're seeing is really what the Romans used to call damnatio memoriae, or the condemnation of memory, which is being enacted, as is typical, on statues within the public square. So if for the Romans you would deface a face or rub out particular images or sort of rub out sort of etchings, you now see if in 2014 marked the so-called Leninopad, right, the falling of the Lenin monuments, 2022 marks the removal of the Pushkin monuments. And one of the things that was really striking about when we think about what this symbol is taken to represent, in Ukraine, Pushkin is held up as a quote-unquote true imperialist. And I think, as Fiona Hill just also pointed out, it's a very contested symbol depending on who is looking. And so and this is all in part of a situation in which you see a variety of renaming. So one that's quite central and notable is Marina Tsvetaeva, who used to have her own road, is now the Alexandra Exeter Road. And so all of these different ways in which these historical layers are being sort of activated and erased. What's been particularly, sorry, this is the Pushkin image. What's been particularly interesting about the Pushkin case is that it has left, obviously, scholars of Russian literature in a profound predicament. Nobody's obviously crying for us, but I mean, I will say it is surprising that Dostoevsky is not being as attacked as much as Pushkin. In any case, obvious, but maybe he is as well. But what is the challenge about Pushkin, let's say, is that if on the one hand, Pushkin can represent a kind of true imperialist, for other artists, these are some of the debates, rereading Russian classics in the shadow of the war, No Guilty People in the World, which is an account by Oksana Zabushka in the TLS. One of the other things about Pushkin is that he can serve other, let's say, Russian exiles as a quintessential figure who has been repressed. And so this is an image from Dmitry Krimov, who is an exiled Russian director. You may have read about this in the New Yorker, who staged his account of Onegin. And the premise is, how do you explain Onegin to basically 4 New Yorkers? And it begins with this sort of searing moment in which an actor screams out, how can you possibly be talking about this during the middle of the war? And it creates this sort of very pregnant, hyper sort of self-lacerating moment of guilt and silence, and then the play proceeds. But what is striking about this particular play is that it really picks up on this central moment, which is that Onegin is itself a work that is born out of Pushkin's exile. And so for a figure like Krimov, he can be activated as the kinds of resources for a Russian artist of thinking about both exile, of repression, and it has led to a kind of quite a sort of, again, a sort of searing reconsideration of the resources within the Russian literary canon itself to represent anti-imperialism and resistance to the state. So the last selection I want to make is to turn really to a remarkable discussion with the Ukrainian poet who writes in Russian, because the last, one of the other alternatives that we have been sort of thinking about is whether departments of Russian could become something like departments of Russian and Russophone, departments of Russian and Slavic, and what will happen really to the teaching of Russian and ultimately what is Russian itself. Russophone has as a kind of one of its central cores the possibility that it could be seen as recognizing a great deal of minorities or people writing in Russian. It has, in some quarters, a kind of positive valence. It can also be seen as oppositional. The difficulty, obviously, is that it's taken over by ideas of Ruski Mir or a kind of Russophonism that is also set up right as the premise for territorial aggression or reincorporation. What is striking, and here I'll just finish with a poet, is that one of the things that is essential really is to remember that or to attend to the large variety of Ukrainian nationals who identify as Ukrainian but who write in Russian. And so the figure here that I just wanted to focus on is Yanis Sinaiko, who is a poet, translator, literary critic, born in 1990 in Lviv. He was interviewed with some colleagues and your own Stephanie Sandler. And one of the questions that he was asked is, why don't you write in Ukrainian? And Sinaiko says, well, I have tried time and time again, but it doesn't work. And one of the reasons he says so is that he doesn't want to turn Ukrainian as a language itself into a tool. And so it is, so he objects sort of fundamentally, and I highly just recommend watching the video. But one thing that he says is that he continues really to try, but ultimately he sort of fails and continues to write in Russian. But he poses one of the most, I think, complex and painful questions that he faces. And he asks how to write in your language that is also the language of your enemy, the raper, killer, and destroyer of your land and cities. And where he ultimately lands is he says, I do not think of my Russian and my writing as the same language as that which uses Russia, Russians, their propaganda, and their army. So one of the things that we are seeing play out really across the board are questions that we are still grappling with around cultural identity, ethnic identity, ethno-linguistic identity. We're dealing kind of questions as we navigate claims of complicity, freedom, and autonomy. And we are really thinking about all of these forms of cultural erasure and reinscription, and really also trying to attend to the lived experience of a variety of individual poets as they are themselves navigating this. Thank you.
So this panel has turned into a bit of true confessions of academics and the discontents and problems that the war has posed on our different fields. But I think it's really an opportunity for you to kind of ask an expert, not just an expert, one of the leading experts in the field, the questions that you might be having about their areas of expertise. And I know we've covered a lot of ground, but please try and focus your questions.
How much time do we have?
How much time do we have?
Was the truth?
No. No.
7 minutes, no problem.
15 minutes. We have 15 minutes. All right. Please introduce yourselves.
Hi, everyone. I'm Katrina. I'm a RICA alum from 2022, currently research Russian propaganda. I'm curious, Professor Colton and anyone else who has thoughts on this, in what ways has the war imposed more constraints on Putin, and in what ways has it reduced the constraints that he faces? If you think about dividing political constraints into simplified groups of elites and the public, in what ways do you think that he faces more threat from those groups or less threat? And I'm curious also about your thoughts on this from an economic perspective.
More threats. Well, it might be a mix, I suppose. I think to the extent that he has to rely on a depoliticized population, which he depoliticized himself, he's loath to make demands of people. And so I think that's what explains the slowness in mobilizing and why Russia is still not taking full advantage of its enormous demographic advantage over Ukraine, whereas the Ukrainians are able to turn that to an advantage because of having been invaded by somebody else. Zelensky doesn't apologize for having to conscript young men. That's an example. I think in previous times of stringency, there were always unwritten rules that stayed the hand of the sovereign to a point. For example, one rule was, in hard times, you never raise the price of alcohol. And I don't know that for a fact that that's happened, but I suspect that it has, that they've laid off that sort of treatment of people. So that they hammer open dissidents, but I think are inclined to treat others with as much care as is possible because of fear of the political repercussions. So it cuts, I guess, both ways. With the elites, well, I think sanctions have really drawn the oligarchs closer to Putin because they're not welcome in the West and their yachts are being taken away and that sort of thing. Of course, there are still secret bank accounts and all the rest of it, but it's become much more difficult. They're not in a position to send their sons and daughters to English boarding schools. So I think there's been a kind of Russification, which has probably played into his hands. He's talked since 2011 or 12 about the offshoreization of the economy. I think some of that's happened. So on balance, it's probably played into his hands. This is off the cuff. I haven't really thought about it very much. What was your other question? It was about the economy, right?
Let's ask Alexandra that. So Alexandra, you've written about the new elites or the new oligarchs around Putin.
All right. So
oh, yes, right.
Yeah. So speaking about new elites and divisions, well, I would say, more broadly speaking, in terms of elite, what we see now, as I feel, is a great process of de-elitization of Russia, and it's a good research question. So can we consider these people as we considered elites previously? Can we consider them as elites anymore? But what I see now is that Putin opened the Pandora box with the process of so-called redistribution or deprivatization of assets, and this related not only of Western owners of assets, but both Russian ones. And here we're at the very beginning of the process, but what I see now that he is quite breaking his deal he made with those who gained their fortune and their capital and their status during privatization of 90s, and the boundaries of this asset landscape now is shaking because of the actions of Attorney General and the new court decisions, which stress the previous decisions, how assets need to be, who assets belongs to. So what I see now that there is a group of people which basically people in the Kremlin trying to find whenever they can, which who get these new assets to management, which it's barely equally to that they are new, that they own them, but of course it's only management. So no one later can say to Putin that he made his fortune without his will, without his permission, and here will be a new class of owners who would be completely dependent on Kremlin with their new status, with their new money, with their new assets, and that's probably the way how Putin tried to cement the facade of the regime he damaged with the war and with sanctions, because mostly this rich people, now both business bureaucrats and I would say also, I think people so-called Slavics, they're quite unhappy with the war, but Putin is the devil they know. That's why they are more get along with him rather than seeking any opportunities here in the West.
I'm actually going to take advantage of the fact that I'm holding the microphone to ask a question. I'm Chris Martin. I'm with the Davis Center, and my question is for Professor Kunichika. I'm curious how you negotiate conversations with your students around the idea of sort of cancel culture, particularly around this, what ethnicity is a writer or an artist, and what you're hearing from your students about that in the Russian perspective right now.
I mean, it is just, that you're seeing here and everywhere as well. It's incredibly pained. But what is fascinating about the case of of Russia and Ukraine is how much it's echoing and serves as a kind of mirror for the ongoing debates. And so it allows for a kind of displacement of some of our own internal discussions around cancel culture as it's projected there. So it's both enabling and disabling, but I think it allows them to see just the variety of cultural dynamics that are taking shape around history and culture. And so it is also curiously something that is both familiar. So it's been very painful, but intriguing for them.
Yeah, Bob Forsman, class of '93, which means that it was called the Soviet Union program when I started, and after the first semester, it changed to Rika. So I have a question to my old faculty, my former faculty advisor, Tim Colton. And the context of the question is to help us discern whether what we've been discussing today is more of a Putin problem or a Russia problem. So Gorbachev had said after the Crimean annexation, there's probably 20 people in here that can correct me if I get this wrong, so apologies. But Gorbachev had said, and it got him canceled in Ukraine, that he would have done the same thing given the events going on in spring, early 2014. As a great author of the seminal Yeltsin biography, and obviously this is unknowable, but in your wise assessment, Tim, had Boris Yeltsin been president in spring of 2014, what would he have done differently, if anything?
Well, he had his chance to get Crimea in 1991 because Kravchuk said that he would have been willing to discuss, alienating Crimea as part of a deal for recognition of Ukrainian independence. So I think he certainly, like almost any Russian politician, I guess he wanted to maximize Russian influence over Ukraine. He was over-optimistic about how much he could accomplish in this regard. But, the 90s was a decade of trading things and trading assets and trading promises that weren't fulfilled. They played this game. They signed the treaty in 1997. Crimea was recognized as part of Ukraine. And I doubt that he would have done what Putin did in 1990. In 2014, I don't think he cared enough about these issues. He prioritized other ones. If I doubt that he would have done what he did in 2014, what Putin did, I'm dead certain he would not have done what Putin did in 2022. He just didn't want that sort of thing. He wanted a different Russia.
Hi, Eric Lohr, class of 93. I have a question, Terry. I'd just like to get your take on where you think this, what feels like a really historic event, the divorce of the Orthodox churches of Russia and Ukraine. It's ongoing and et cetera, but how does that fit into your sort of schema of the various boundaries of Russian national identity and et cetera?
Yeah, thanks, Eric. I mean, I think that it fits into what Sergei was saying about the consequences of the war, of breaking down the ideology, and in this case the institutions of the of the big Russian nation, because the Orthodox Church is the major presence of Russianists in the daily lives of large amounts of Ukrainians. And one of the sort of historical questions that I thought should be put on the agenda by the war is kind of the, so a big thing that happens this is getting off to the top a little, but a big thing that happens, right, with Lenin and Stalin is that they institutionalize Ukrainian and Belarusian identities. So, so you have a rejection of the big Russian nation. But it survives as kind of a habitual way of thinking, and it survives in a whole variety of ways. One way it survived in was the fact that the Ukrainian Autocephalous Church gets abolished in 1930, despite Ukrainizatia, and the Greek Catholic Church gets abolished in 1945. They're not doing that with other nationalities, So it suggests that was, and the Slavic core and the ability to move up from Ukraine to the Politburo in a way you couldn't elsewhere suggested it was ongoing. So anyways, I think that's a crucial issue for this time.
And Terry will meet you out and back in the alley for that question. So I'm sorry that we have to stop now. We have 5 minutes for a coffee break. So we're going to thank the panel. You're going to grab the coffee and come back immediately, please.